begin with the admonition that the public comment period closed in May 21st, 2016, and so comments made at this point shouldn't be expecting a formal response as we move forward with our responses. So I said we were going to start up about where we left off, which was at comment 248. That comment, and there's several that appear off of that as we go back through, essentially, to my mind, is a repetition of what we were seeing before, which is a statement that the science here inadequately addresses the issues of coastal chaparral and the effectiveness of the proposed management there. I actually feel that the degree to which the document addresses coastal issues has been significantly enhanced already as we move through draft. And there's been extensive consultation on it. So I think some of this is an artifact of the early interaction. So I would say on many of these, a statement that we have actually heard comments about the ecology, the specific ecology of coastal chaparral systems is going to lump together. We'll identify some others.
Chairman, so when you mean early interactions, you mean like previous versions?
Yes.
Okay.
That's right.
That's what I was.
So I think some of the public comments are a legacy of early drafts and early comment discussion. The 260 is one where it tears off some others as well, and this is a comment which essentially says the goals, it makes a statement as to what the goals of the document are, which is not what the stated goals of the document are. And so I think the assertion that we have goals other than the stated goals is a problematic assertion. The goals are what they are stated as, not in this case to reduce regulatory hurdle. That's not the primary goal of the document, although it's a true statement, and that's why you do programmatic EIR. It's not to reduce regulatory hurdle, but to actually make it easier to comply with the regulatory mandate. Right? That you're trying to get some of the work done in advance. The next two comments, 266 and 272, are essentially the same. They are statements that there is no science foundation. Again, we've had some repeated statements there. Do you feel the report is adequately citing the science foundation? If we don't give direction to the team or to staff otherwise, moving forward at this point is a statement that we actually feel for programmatic EIR. There's a science foundation for the document based on the work that's done internally and especially after the response to the Fire Science Consortium is adequate. I'm comfortable with that assertion. It does reflect that. It is not a scientific treatise, but it does draw on the available scientific data.
So that's what I was going to get at.
Yes.
Because that's been some of the challenge of the underpinning of those challenges has been, I think everybody knows there's not just one silver bullet of a research out there that describes success or failure of some of these processes. Yes. So we're having to use kind of imperfect science and then also case studies.
I wouldn't even say imperfect science. Science is what it is. It gives you some insight into phenomena, and the insight is not without ambiguity because they're not simply replications of the same experiment. They're different areas.
So I guess that's. Do we have something in the Vtpeir that kind of describes that we feel comfortable with the level of science we have and what the outcomes are likely to be from the proposed activities, but we recognize that there may be some outcomes that are different. That's why we have adaptive management. And some kind of statement in here that kind of leads us to that.
Well, there are statements in there that set it up as adaptive management. We could say, my impression would be is we do not make an assertion in the document that it's the science is adequate, that's actually a judgment well we're made from reading it, and the science is cited throughout where appropriate. Would that be a fair statement from your standpoint on the team?
Gabe Schultz of Vtpeir. Yeah, so we don't have a statement that says the science is good enough. You make a statement like that, you put a bullseye on you, and you say, please, prove us wrong. That's not the way this is set up. This is identified as we used the best science available. And that's the direction just that this is offered here. So the comment doesn't exist in it because it's based off of the current science. So the purpose of it is that, yes, this is utilizing the best available information out there. So therefore, it should be the best information that anyone could find for it. If that makes sense.
Yeah. No, and I guess that's phrased better than I proposed it, because that's what I was feeling, was that it wasn't that the inappropriate use of any science that was out there. It was we were using the best, but we will collect, obviously through the adaptive management process, new information over time.
Correct.
And because the assertion being here is that veiled is that, well, we need to go off and study this and get it 100% set in place before we propose some kind of management action. I guess I want to make, I don't know what
that would be a naive statement about science.
Well, I know. And so that's what I'm getting at is are these from a legacy? Have they actually read the new version? Because if there's some statements about adaptive management, I know Wayne Spencer, I would have thought he might have mentioned that or understood that better.
I think we may end up having a round where we have to make a statement on this, but I think some of these statements do reflect in part a legacy of a conversation that because of the weight of the document sometimes moves outside the orbit of the document.
The reason why is because I don't want to just like what Gabe was saying. I don't want Vtpeir and the board to get pinned into an argument that all the science is in and this is the end of it. That's kind of that's what's being said here by the comment. We want to make sure we are taking the high ground that says, hey, we're using the best available, but we are going to, as we learn, we're going to adapt.
I think the statements in here.
So, if we're getting multiple comments along this line, I don't know. Is there some place in the document we could make it even clearer? But maybe we're just chasing something.
Because it covers so much, I think the adequacy of the science is a gestalt.
Yeah.
Judgment on the document. It's not something you can simply make true by assertion or that it is true or not true. Okay. Yeah. 280, again, it's a statement about what the goals are. I think the goals of the PEIR are relatively clearly stated. But it's saying the priority is how you manage fuel. I think there is certainly an overwhelming evidence or overwhelming concern with fuel because it is a vegetation treatment program. But that's not the goals as stated in there. A number like the one in P7 essentially say it's not good work and there's not much we can do to respond to that. It's not good. But the assertion is such that P12 on the top of page 22. This mixes two of these threads together. The science foundation being inadequate, but it's the first one we've dealt with today, which I would categorize as an overstatement of the extent of the treatments. And while people are concerned that this program could have too heavy or too extensive a footprint on the landscape, the wording of the statement I think is no statement of the P13 is back to that statement of what the goals are, where it's stating the goals, which are not the goals stated. The goal to burn, right? That's not the goal necessarily. The goal was the state that we take the summary and look at treatment alternatives to try to achieve those objectives. P25 basically said deal with all comments, which is exactly what we're trying to deal with today. P31 doesn't provide an operative criticism in the sense that it essentially says this document is not prepared or should be P32 has, at the start of this page, P32 down to P43 on page 23 really are all statements that the objective here is coastal chaparral clearing. And I simply don't accept that as an assertion. Does anyone else on the board? I mean, this is not a statement going more, I think, as it would be the material outcome of projects approved under this PPI. It's certainly not on our minds. Anyone comment on that?
It harkens back to our trip to Ventura and to the management for rangeland and chaparral. So I understand the concern that these are all going to be vetted, and there's a lot of different project detail that
yeah, I just don't think anyone associated with the program actually has that as an objective. And I think that the difficulties of managing those coastal chaparral ecosystems are well recognized in the report and by the agency. And we share the residents' concerns. Sorry, my eyes are breaking it out. Again, the next statement I just marked down. Or P45 and 56 were basically saying you reached the wrong conclusion, don't move forward. It's a rejection of the document, but it's not other than a statement. We shouldn't move this forward. It's not a respondable comment in the sense of having a
is there just one question, Keith, since this is kind of a big one for me, this concern over chaparral.
Yeah.
When we provide the official response to this, there's places in here there are constraints in place to how much chaparral will be managed, how much is predicted to be managed. I see my memory refresh in terms of if someone says, well, I'm afraid you're going to be 22 million acres of chaparral management. How do we're going to point to somewhere in our official response and say this is really what we're going to do, and there's these other safeguards in place to address your concern.
Well, the hard limits are at the level of the program. I think the response has to point out, have we treated the ecology of the coastal chaparral systems, and whether or not this would result in a burn frequency too frequent for the natural recoveries? Would it impair the resilience of the system?
Or lead to the type conversion.
Lead to type conversion, yeah. And so I think we need to point to where the limitations on the use of management are in there. I think the zoning of where the treatments take place is also a response. That the goals, as you move out into the backcountry, are very different and have to be based on essentially considerations that are expressed here, which means you wouldn't engage in a process that would ultimately degrade if your justification had to be restoration. So I think that's the core, where the ecology dealt with, what was the scale of the impact, like with the number of acres that would be treated near home homes away from homes. P47 in the middle of that was just, do the consultation like we're doing today, come up with good responses. Then it was back in P72 to clear cut the chaparral as the objective, which I couldn't disagree with more. As you move on to P63, you're going to go ahead into the category for me of an overstatement of the treatment impacts into that same category. I thought the statement or the comment P72 was actually a very thoughtful one, and I actually agree with some of the comments, but some of those comments are not actually criticisms of what's in the draft TEIR. The notion that essentially we partly create a risk by building structures which are inappropriately designed or placed in high-risk areas.
It's true.
It's absolutely true, right? Yes, I agree. It's been part of my own research. On the other hand, this board doesn't have the authority to order, land use in that sense, just to do the process we do, like on the Research Protection Committee, where we're looking at fire safe ordinances and products. But the notion that we would go beyond that mandate on this board, or that society might, doesn't, to me, argue against the need for a PEIR or vegetation program in general. Although I do agree with some of the things that humans are the cause of their own problems. Certainly an issue here. And I don't know, anyone want to spend any more time on that? So.
Well, I do think that if you read Jim Wells's whole letter, it wasn't necessarily a criticism of the document.
But this is true.
Because in some of these, because they have to be separated out, when you read the letter, it's not necessarily a criticism of the document. It's just a comment about how, fire management in California. And so I think we're kind of in the mode where we're saying all of the comments are criticisms of the document, but some of them are actually in sync with the document. Because I did look this one up, and I think he can't remember when I read the actual comment. I don't know how we respond. How you'll respond to the ones that are just that are basically in agreement. He's primarily, I think, talking just agreeing that there's a problem.
I think three of these I agree completely with in this section. One, I'd say the zoning issue you're really discussing is beyond the scope of the board's authority. The one that I have some question about, but I don't know that we can come to an agreement on because this isn't necessarily a testable hypothesis, is the second one, which is the directly proportional notion that the extent to which you're doing this is directly, the environmental degradation is directly proportional. Because in some cases, fuel reduction, especially even close to homes, is actually moving something back towards a more natural environment. I think about some of the places where we've created an afforested situation around homes that should be savannas, and I think, well, this isn't true in all situations. So that one I would have some issues with. The three of them I flat out agree with.
It's a
Great. So, but we have to be careful. Just in some cases, the comment is good and it's agreed. And I don't. If we agree and the document would say otherwise, then we have a problem. And other than the notion in the next one, the next portion was pulled out of the same comment by Wells. I'm mostly in agreement on this, that, collaborative planning is partly what we're trying to set in motion here, especially as you move towards the project level review and trying to provide for public engagement there. And fire is not the enemy here. It's just part of our environment. And then, as I said before, I felt the last one on that page is back to an overstatement of the impacts of the program. Shall we move on to the next page? The first one here, which was interesting, I felt a lot of that was a true statement, and in fact, it's what the choice of projects has to weigh out. And so, as part of the PEIR, you wouldn't get to the level of some of those choice of projects, but things like where would a project be effective and where would it be ineffective? Building on the research on some of these linear events and stuff, that's exactly what I would want at a local level where those phenomena dominate to figure in the evaluation of the project.
Well, there is a discussion of spotting versus the width of the fuel break in the document. I think I couldn't put my finger on it exactly right now, Edith, but there is discussion of the problem that
I think it even cites Larry Davis's dissertation.
Yeah, so I think we just need to go back to that spot in the document and
so the
reference to spotting versus what time of day a fire hits a fuel break and the need to do burning out from fuel breaks in advance of the fire front. Whether it's as specific as it would be, it would need to be to address this. I don't know. We might want to reinforce it a little bit, but I don't think it's not knowledge. We might want to, because it's always a concern width and location of fuel breaks versus what the fuel type is. It's always a concern. Mm-hmm. And it just depends on what particular day and under what conditions the fire is burning under. So we might want to go back to the document and find a couple of pages where it's addressed. A lot of these comments, and including on the first day, really, starting with the first one we addressed and going down the line, really do say you haven't proved that fuel treatments work to stop fires. Mm-hmm. And that's frequently a comment on any kind of, even a project level or a large-scale strategy. Mm-hmm. It's true because you can never show that something worked if it prevented, it's very difficult to do. I'm sure you have some kind of a name for that. It's not good.
There is a name.
There is a name for it. I can't remember what it is, but it's where something doesn't occur, and but you can't necessarily show that the strategy that you employed was the reason that it didn't occur.
It depends on how many variables.
Yeah.
Perfect paired studies rarely happen without planning as far as fire-wise, I guess.
But this is, we'll need to have someplace where we do address that it's hard to prove that fuel treatments work because they, and all these things of case studies, cherry picking times, it's true. It's very difficult to show that. So
Sure, I don't think there's a statement necessarily. I can't remember. Of course, this document does now come in the largest binder ever produced.
we think.
We think. we
Don't challenge us if I am.
Yeah. Largest binder I have ever witnessed personally.
Outside of the Egyptian pyramids.
Yes. But some statement to the effect of the scientific evidence on the effectiveness of treatments suffers from some limitations of your ability to extrapolate beyond the study area, right? So you can look at case studies and say, in the case of this fire break system was judged by people on the fire to have helped them with the containment of the fire, right? There's a case study that Rachel Smith and I wrote in Fire Management Today about one of those. Very, very site-specific, right? And even there, because it's not an actual experiment, it's your subjective assessment that what helped you here was the presence of this or that fire break, which allowed you to deploy your resources in a certain way. But it's a little different than did the liquid turn blue, right? So.
Well, I know, the Joint Fire Science Program has tried to address this through any number of grants. And it does come back to usually, with our the objective being to help managers make good decisions about what type of fuel treatment you do and what fuel type and how it's located in the landscape and how much of it you do. And I think I can't really tell you whether it might be worth taking a look at some of that to see how much progress they've made on that particular topic. But in this case, I think in general we're talking about Southern California.
Yeah.
And I can't think of. It does come down to, in many cases, a leap of faith and mostly adaptive management to put in enough of these fuels treatments to start to show some kind of effect.
That's right. And so I suppose at a higher level, we should make sure that we have a statement in there that acknowledges how far you can extrapolate from studies.
An individual, yeah.
But even where you do extrapolate and put it in a sort of a broader context, you're experimenting virtually, right? You're doing something like the work of Dr. Finney, where you're looking at modeling hypothetical fires moving across, even if it's an actual landscape with hypothetically placed fuel treatments, right? Otherwise, it does come down to an examination of case studies.
Well, and
with subjective evaluation.
Yes, yeah, and the variables, you have to hold something constant, so, yeah.
Frustration.
Well, this has been a good discussion for me because as I read through the comments, it's kind of this overwhelming message that what's being proposed, a general model of what's being proposed, will have these negative effects on the environment, and et cetera. It's going to induce fire spotting and moving faster. In other words, when you read that page after page after page, I just want to be in the big picture confident that we have demonstrated in the document that the model that we're using, which is to reduce fuel and create fuel breaks, and it's really what you two were just discussing. But I just want to have that essential sense of being comfortable that that's adequately discussed in the document. And I think maybe the reason I'm even bringing this up is that I probably in my rather undisciplined reading of this, jumping around, what have you, I may not have found really where do we talk about that and where have we dispelled all this Chaparral Institute points and said, that really isn't that.
Some cases we agree with it, but it's the extract. We agree with the ecological integrity of that area.
Right. Okay. So we're acknowledging that, and so our process will account on a project-by-project basis that all those factors will be properly accounted for.
But I think we should simply assert what is stated here for some of these objections. We are not proposing clear cutting.
Yes,
I agree.
Right. I agree.
This simply is not what the document says.
Right. I do agree. There's some things you can.
And I think that says something about the passion of it.
Yes.
Although on the other hand, it also says something. I heard a talk recently by the linguist George Lakoff, who talked about the link between rhetoric and neuroscience and what actually happens to your cognition if something is repeated to you.
That must be a case study that was.
It's sort of which figures into marketing and politics. So let's move on to this comment P97, which I think is just a simple misunderstanding. The original may have been changed that this was made on, but looking at the draft we have, it says, in fact, not that the most destructive fires are predominantly in the mountain. It says that right on page 39, as it said, it's still on the same page. Second paragraph. Oh, no, I'm sorry, it was down at the bottom. Second sentence, the wildland fuels of California occur mainly on mountainous terrain. So it's saying, if we want to say that's an overstatement, that there are parts of San Diego that do have wildland fuels and are relatively flat, for instance. So it could be an overstatement of the spatial distribution of the wildland fuels on rough terrain versus flatter terrain. So in that sense it's there, but it doesn't necessarily say that the fires are in the mountainous terrain. So I don't know, Sue, you're the closest thing to an expert I know on this. Would you say that that's an overstatement? A true statement would be many of the wildland fuels of California occur in mountainous terrain. But is it accurate to say occur mainly, or is that an overstatement, do you think?
I think it's fine.
Terrain is an issue, especially in the areas that are really under this VTPEIR, right? Partly that's why they're under that and not under local control.
Exactly.
Yeah, I was talking about fuels, and they're talking about...
Yeah, so I think it's just a simple misread.
Yeah.
Right?
And now, I'm not sure the comment, obviously we just talked about justified the conclusion the commenter made, which was about scale and recommending use of smaller scales, and we talked about how this document isn't part of PRC, the real small 100-foot clearing.
Well, that's true. The fact that we say it's mostly there doesn't mean in a project level analysis.
It's not there. I mean, it's obviously
right. Obviously, the terrain was.
So, I mean, we've been looking at this thing for so many months, so I've lost track of. I know it can't be in the analysis because that's not what's being proposed to this group. But I thought we put in here somewhere where that element was still going to go on, because this isn't the only comment that talks about the smaller scales.
Well, that's true, and so
where is that?
references to that shouldn't just be, well, partly it's in here, we need to make sure it's clear, but it's the project level analysis as opposed to when we're trying to make statements, as this one is, about the state as a general characterization, right? That's not to say a generalization about the state doesn't have a local situation that differs completely.
Yeah, I'm not really worried about that, because I think it will be taken care of in the project level analysis. But I just wanted the team to point me to where we talk about the 4291 and the clearing, and that is going on. Do you have a place, Rachel?
Chapter 1.
Yeah, that's right. I was kind of homing around chapter 1, and I found it in the justification for authority, but I wasn't finding what page.
Yeah.
So I know we've talked about this.
Well, and
There's a whole section about it.
I think we've talked at previous workshops about expanding that section because there have been some other comments.
173.
Okay.
Second page. Or the following page after 173. So 1-15 and 1-16.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Thanks. I'll look through that, because that's much like Rich. There's just some overarching themes that come out in comment letter again and again and again. It's the comment that the public seems to have lost. That they think that all the other treatments are going away, and this is the only one that's going to occur when that's not true.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I don't know if that's because it's just been drummed into them from previous versions of this document, or it's not clear in here. And obviously, the only thing we can change is making it clear.
That's right.
You know.
I heard it kind of slightly different. That they're not saying that they're going away. They're saying emphasize those. Make sure your house, make sure your dwelling is built up to a higher standard. We don't do building code here per se, or make sure that you have 100 feet of space. Well, we do manage that. And they're saying just focus on those instead of going out to the hinterlands and calling for this ecological restoration. So similar to what you're saying,
But I think the balance of the activities under this plan impact is dealt with here in numerous places.
yeah, I'd agree with that.
The focus of most of the anticipated treatment sites is in fact consistent with focusing on, closer to the urban areas. So.
One other comment I wanted to add back to what Member Wade brought up was, where does it address this bigger theme, particularly Chaparral, because that's the one that rises big in my head. There's 530, there's the cumulative impacts discussion relative to biological impacts, and it kind of covers that and talks about statewide, it's not going to be a big impact because you're limited by the number of acres to be treated, etc. You're going to deal with regional impacts of your project level analysis and the mitigation. And I don't see Chaparral called out in this section, but I'm sure there's other sections where there's a detailed discussion of the biology of Chaparral. Is that true? Section 4.
Chapter 4.
Chapter 4. Okay, great. Thank you. So probably between Chapter 4 and the cumulative impacts of biological, that's where you're going to understand how that's been considered and why we find the findings.
Well, the section on Chaparral is much longer than any of the other sections.
Section's okay.
It's way more detailed in terms of that was one of my comments, is that it was sort of out of balance with.
I think that was also
a response to your
Yeah.
trip to Southern California.
And soliciting.
So I think that's probably for a nice official response, was that we've heard this, and this is the theme that's come true.
That's why there's so much.
Yeah, that's why there's so much information about it. Yeah.
Just keep going through. Level 58 was basically the same as what we call it. If we decide to proceed with it, conclusions.
Mr. Chairman?
I thought we've already dealt with these.
I was just going to say, yeah.
That we did deal with
August
that.
23rd.
Yeah, in August. I have notes through page
That's right.
27.
We did those.
We did the ones of program necessity.
We did the ones of program
So,
necessity,
we're
so
just
we
going
do
to
jump to.
program effectiveness.
We did
Yeah.
do some of those as well.
We pick it up, my notes indicate you pick it up on middle of page 27.
Yeah, I have the
Yeah.
same.
That's where I have
Yeah.
Mark.
That's right. And where we get into the discussion, where we got into emphasis on defensible space and
27, 148.
Yeah, this program scope and contents.
yeah,
I don't believe we've covered extensively.
exactly. And the two comments there are, really about coming back to the issue of the area focus near defensible space, reinforcement of defensible space. And so, in effect, I think we agree that's an important focus. That's not the focus of this document, but that is a companion piece to that work, which is a major emphasis on, all fire departments' work and the board's other programs. Right.
Well, I think we can refer to.
It is reference.
Yeah, the fire marshal has a great deal of information posted on home flammability. We can
That's right.
point to that.
That's
And,
right.
we were just talking about this today
Yeah.
in the Resource Protection Committee, again, related to the responsibility for local and county government and how those codes interface. So,
Yeah, agreed. So if we skip on to page 28, there are the questions there, which is about, again, the efficacy. First time 032 or 032 was about the efficacy under extreme conditions of field treatments, and I think we've already talked about that one. The next one, again, has, I think, an overstatement of what is envisioned here, which should be just called an understatement. Although parts of this statement one agrees with, in the sense of, reduce the immutability of structures in the immediate surroundings. And so I think we can say, again, like the previous one, we agree with that.
So we may have like an official response on these, Edith. These are, something like we're agreeing and you're pointing to the place in the document where that occurs.
Well, or where the relevant programs that implement.
Or relevant
Right.
programs under the fire marshal.
Right, yeah.
Actually,
This document covers vegetation treatment projects or activities. For, yes, home ignitability is important. That falls under the fire marshal's office. Here's their material about that.
But in here, like that area I was asking for, if Rachel's, page 114, 15, we actually restate some of these things that, in this case, maybe it's a fire marshal, but it could be other programs.
Well, the programs that we restate in the document are part of the CEQA requirement to discuss related projects. So, combustible home building materials isn't really the team determined wasn't really a related project to vegetation treatment, whereas something like defensible space is. So that's how we that's how we picked what related programs would would get further discussion in the document.
So, as you move on, the importance of defensible space and focusing there is great. When you move on to the next one, and I actually wanted to hear from you on this one. Sorry, this seems to be an overly generalized advocacy of forest cover.
yeah, I was just looking at it again.
38.
38, yeah. Well, it's true that I think we need to restate the definition of defensible space, which is basically 100 feet total, with 30 feet. The first 30 feet can be characterized the way that it's characterized here. The second 70 feet, so we're talking about 100 feet around a house. The second 70 feet, homeowners aren't encouraged to remove all vegetation. They're encouraged to treat the surface fills.
Yeah.
So I would just go back to the definition of, it's pretty clear what the defensible space is, and it's the responsibility of the homeowner, and it's actually pretty specific about how to treat. Now the home ignition zone, I have not heard of this new. The home ignition zone is something new to me. I'm sure someone's coined it. Maybe they did. Maybe the Sequoia Forest Keepers coined that. It's not an acronym that I've seen before, and maybe the team saw that in somewhere besides the comments. I have never seen that used before. So I think we could restate defensible, just respond to what defensible space is defined at, and then I don't know what to do with the new term that has come up here. It looks like, because it's not in, I don't think that it's in Jack Cohen's papers. It doesn't look like they've talked about Jack Cohen, and but I don't recall that Dr. Cohen actually coined this term.
I don't know. Oh, did you Google?
I was gonna say, yeah. I've looked on the internet.
Curtis is ahead of us.
Yeah.
Who is
It looks.
Jack Cohen.
Oh, he is?
And it's-
Jack.
It is from Jack. Okay, well, that proves me wrong, that's for sure.
It's heavily used by the Firewise organization.
Oh, okay.
Oh, so this is based on this work about.
Well, ignitability. But see, this is a zone around houses. That would be a alternative to the way CAL FIRE defines WUI. I think a lot of this is, kind of an advocacy of some of this structure ignition stuff to the exclusion of anything else. So there's some truth, there's some accurate. Jack, he has, when he's talking about the objective only being protecting structures, he does advocate for other kinds of fuel treatment besides that. It's just that in relation to just protecting structures, I think probably we need to go ahead and talk about that this primarily relates to forested areas. And that would make sense if this particular commenter is from a forested area.
Yeah.
But it's important that we go back to the objectives of the document, and they are not. The objective of the document is not to only protect structures.
Correct.
The objectives are more wide-ranging than that.
Yes.
Does that help, Edith? So the one thing is that the objectives go beyond just protecting homes, and that most of Dr. Cohen's research has to do with fires in forested areas. And then making sure we define defensible space and don't get it mixed up with this other terminology, his new acronym.
Okay. So, again, the next comment is along the same lines. I think the response is the same.
The next one, yeah. Well, then you mean the.
Again.
Oh, I was responding to both of those.
Together, right.
Those together, yeah. The one after that is a rehash of the 22 million acre issue.
That's right. It's
yeah.
the overstatement kind of treatment impact. Although I actually felt the last bullet was a good statement as to why you needed programmatic EIR rather than an indictment against one. That the number of configurations and stuff, but there is some efficiencies in the collection of information on this and the assessment at the high level of this stuff across all those combinations of doing a document like this, rather than that being the reason why you shouldn't do it. So, yeah.
And you mean in also 157, which is
Yes,
the same, yeah.
that's right. That effectively, as it says, set boundaries will in effect, the document does set those boundaries as part of its purpose. As you move on to page 30, again, the statement of deforestation in the quarter of California, this is an overstatement or subdivision, would be allowable. Then we have two statements which are pay attention to the coastal chaparral, which we are and we will. And the next statement was
You mean PS?
yeah,
P5.
P5. And to some extent, I think I would simply say the directions there are things that we've tried to do here. We have tried to incorporate the best science through going out to the Fire Science Consortium. We have tried through this extensive treatment of the chaparral systems to recognize the fact that while this is, a statewide PEIR, the differences between the chaparral kind of community and the forest community are recognized. The focus is on the underlying motivations, not just on the structure. So I actually felt this was a statement as to what we had done, not what we should do. So, if I'm not seeing any disagreement,
I mean, this is one of those themes that I was bringing up before that we keep hovering around, and for whatever reason, the public doesn't have a clear understanding of, is that when we read the document, and the team reads the document, it's very clear what other things, what other treatments are going on out there. And I don't know if I can use this word, but I haven't found the word used in the Vtpeir, but it's complementary to these other programs that are going on out there. But for whatever reason, the public, it's not very clear that it's complementary. It's like it's being done in a vacuum.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Even though, but that's the message. That's not they're not getting that message. And
Maybe up front that could be looked at because there are all these tools.
Yeah, there's all these tools, and we do a nice job, and the team did a really nice job when you start in that first chapter laying out the different programs that are out there, CFIP and the 4291 and everything. But when it got to, I was looking for maybe a paragraph or something that said right at the start of the Vtpeir, well, this is to complement and work with and add on to those other programs, and it doesn't say that.
Mm-hmm.
But we all feel that. I mean, that's what we see is happening.
Yes.
Right. And it's easy, if you don't know about those, it's easy to criticize this for what it's not doing.
Yeah.
Because it appears there's a gap, or it's ignoring something.
Or we have or the document doesn't identify, hey, these work together. This is filling the gap, essentially, what we think. Because we think that the defensible space is being handled sufficiently. We don't really have jurisdiction over the structures and the construction levels and their techniques. And
Yeah.
we add on, what we can do is add on, where 4291 kind of stops, we can add on to that. And that's what kind of this document does.
So I heard you say that we did add some language to that effect that talks about these other issues. Can you?
Yeah, well, I think,
Yeah.
I mean, it was where Rachel pointed out was in chapter 1, starting on, actually, it's kind of, if you read it, it's section 1.7, where it's kind of an overview of the different major treatment methods that are in the state of California. Like Edith indicated, I think the rewrite was, for additional information, was in this 1.73 that dealt with 4291. And then it goes into CFIP, and then it brings into the VTP.
Remember, Miles, what I was talking about was, I think at our August workshop, this issue had been brought up, and sort of like a to-do item was to add more of that. Yeah, so it hasn't actually been, I can't direct it to you because it hasn't been done yet.
So it seems like there's either one of two ways to do it, either to bring into your executive summary more of a discussion of this is what you'll find elsewhere in the document, and for what member Barbara brought forward, and that's discussion 1.7. Otherwise, you talk about it in your official comments of this is where you find that information, and it has been considered, and it is in there. As terms prepared, and we don't revise the term. But you think we should bring it forward to help people? I don't know if people are going to read this again after it gets approved. But we did consider it, we do recognize it, and it's a reality.
Right. Yeah, because we agree. I mean, that's. I think that's going to be the frustrating part for the public is when we just say, yeah, we agree.
But we're going to say we agree to see section 1.7.
Well, but in that it's a nice bullet. What I'm looking at is it's a nice and it's very complete bullet item of everything that occurs, but it doesn't. There's not that paragraph either at the start of that or in the executive summary that says this is how we believe these are linked together. And how they are going to work in the environment together. And why we don't think this is being done in a vacuum. And we need to just focus on 4291. Because we're seeing this comment after comment after comment. Now, maybe it's because they're copying and pasting their comments, but in some cases, I don't think so. It just seems like somewhere, whether it be in this section or, like you said, because people won't always dive into the document, in the executive summary, whether it's a short paragraph of a couple sentences that says this is how this is linking with these other major programs, not to list every project that could possibly happen. Is that kind of what you were thinking you were going to have to do from our previous comments?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's pretty important to be clear on that. Otherwise, this thing just keeps getting criticized as not addressing the issue.
Yeah.
When it's not intended to address certain.
Right.
Comment 257, I just wanted to emphasize, there's a lot in the Bio 5 SPR that hits on that. So you might want to make sure that gets referred to, and it might even be worth looking at Bio 5 a little bit more specifically to see if we can add something. Because that's mitigation measures for veg treatments and chaparral. It might be one way to flesh that out a little bit more. And case, we're talking about South Coast shrublands, but I think it's the same habitat.
I guess the other side of what you brought forward is to, okay, make sure we understand that we're treating from the inside out, or that there is things.
And we agree with that.
We agree with that. The other part is, okay, well, don't do anything out there. We've already touched upon, well, one of our objectives or goals of the program is reduce the potential for high severity fires by restoring and maintaining a range of native fire adapted plant communities through periodic low intensity treatments within the appropriate vegetation types. I think that takes care of that. Certainly one of the issues we've heard is that you're treating those things, but then how do we know they don't get occupied by invasive species and we lose the native species? But we have a monitoring program for that, and we'll want to point that out as well in our official response.
Right, because certain treatments lead to a requirement for follow-up treatment. Otherwise, they may be worse than no action.
Yeah.
Possible. I don't know. Maybe I will say that, but it seems like certain treatments without follow-up, the benefits are pretty short.
Yeah, no, I was just focusing on what it says you're trying to have a native plant community, and if you're doing something that results in a non-native plant community, then you're not meeting that goal. Are we once going to show up with a picture of a bunch of Italian thistles? This used to be a chaparral place, and now it's this other thing. Yeah,
All right, let's move on. As we move to page 30, I think the first one is really back to the same unstable impacts. We move into, we need to recognize the return interval issue in coastal chaparral. I think we've got the places to point to on that. The next statement is the same, focus on risk. We did that, and then, as you round out that page, the real issue is on what is our scope in this PEIR relative to other programs, say under the fire marshal, on structures and the need for transparency and public input. And I think we can point in this document to the treatment of public input, both in the process of the development of this and at the project level. Then, as you move on, actually the next 7 comments really are all the same comments.
Starting with
and I
what numbers again?
Oh, I'm sorry. Starting with 086 through 0197. So that would mean all 3 comments on page 31, all 3 comments on page 32, and the first comment on page 33. And so I'll give you a second to look at those. But to me, they are all statements of essentially contesting the value of a programmatic EIR relative to the projects and what is appropriate for inclusion. And if, in fact, so the call there is for project level information, which, to me sort of misses the point as to what the purpose of this document is relative to the analysis of projects underneath it. So I'll give you a second to scan this and see. I mean, this is a comment we've come up with before about the balance of detail between a long-term programmatic EIR and projects which take place within a fairly short period and require subsequent review.
Yeah, I read those, and I tend to agree with that. It's as if they're just approaching it from a traditional EIR perspective.
Yes.
On every one of those comments.
Yeah. And while much of what they're citing about what an EIR is, I felt it was missing the point as to what a programmatic EIR is. We could be proved wrong, right? But that would call into question, if some of these comments were true, I don't think you could write a programmatic EIR. If we then skip ahead to on 33, the two remaining comments, starting with 0249, going down through the first three on P59, really are all statements about whether or not the fire breaks work and are treated appropriately in the document. In many cases, I think there's a statement that I think there's a pervasive misconception that a lot of new fuel breaks are going to be constructed, and I actually don't see that as a very likely outcome. That I think there will be a fair amount of fuel break maintenance with local community support, but I don't see a lot of new construction, and some of this would imply that you're investing the funds in effective treatment. So any feelings about whether or not we have overstated the effectiveness of fuel breaks? I think we talked about earlier today even statements where we do have to say there's a generally regarded idea that they're effective, but that it is tough to prove at a very high kind of metal level.
Of all the potential treatments, that one has the highest potential for environmental impacts, in my opinion, whether it's arcsites or habitat modification, unless it's a maintenance of an existing one.
But I feel, doesn't the document make it pretty clear we are unlikely to be constructing a lot of new?
I don't know.
No, we're not.
So that's a comment.
Well, in order to analyze, and the team could talk about, in order to analyze fuel breaks, it's basically a model that calls out the number of acres in each fuel type where fuel breaks could be potentially effective. And I think you have to do that because it's still so in order to do fuel breaks in SRA, especially in forested areas, there is potential for a lot more thinning and field break construction either on ridge tops or along roads in forested areas. I think most of these concerns are about new field breaks on ridge tops in Southern California. So
and that's why I stopped it.
Right.
I felt actually the question about, I don't see a lot of shaded fuel breaks in Southern California, and my feeling was, no, neither do I. That's really a Northern California issue. You're right. These were the
but in terms of
to their work.
And I wasn't thinking of the shaded fuel breaks when I was
right. But that's a really important part of the program.
So that's true. And so my saying these are all, it's not an expansion. You're right. In forested fuel types,
it could be, and
it could be.
Maybe it should be in terms of thinning on ridge tops and along roads to create areas for shaded fuel breaks. So I think, but the focus of all the comments seem to be on Southern California shrublands, but the modeling does model potential locations and numbers of acres for fuel breaks in Southern California as well. And it is possible that we might want to consider, if we were going to do any modifications, of excluding, since there's so much public concern, excluding those. And then just doing maintenance activities on field breaks. But it gets complicated because there's a lot of places where field breaks were put in the past in Southern California, chaparral, where they're no longer maintained. And I'm not really clear on whether the department continues to map those or not, or whether this program could potentially reinstate some of those. And a lot of it has to do with we didn't always track where those were in the past. And that's why the team at a programmatic level really had to look at topographic features and
pick
road
out where
locations
they
to
could
pick out where they
yeah.
could potentially be. There was no other way to do it, to give you a certain number of acres that could be treated by that treatment type. It isn't. I do think it's an area where it's a somewhat of a vulnerability in the document, and not so much because of how it was modeled, but because of lack of record keeping in the past about where fuel breaks have existed and whether they're currently being maintained.
That's a good note. We should consider whether or not we need to make some modifications to the document that. We'll have to go back and see where that's at.
Well, there is a recommendation, and the department, it's acknowledged in the document that better record keeping would be really helpful in program design, and it says that a number of different places. And so the objective of the program would be to do a much better job reporting through CalMapper but that doesn't make it possible to go back and reconstruct the history of fuel treatments if records were kept in the past. And I think that's a dilemma that everybody has about historical programs. Can't fix it. But I do agree that it is unlikely that that fuel breaks would be created on all the, on that, because you can have a balance of treatments, and perhaps there's a possibility for doing fuel break work, and we certainly looked at some areas in the forested part of Southern California where fuel breaks actually have to be almost reconstructed because all the trees in the shaded fuel break were, remember, dead? Right. And
Yeah. Right. And actually, some of the historical ones probably won't be maintained because the land use pattern has changed so dramatically around them. In other cases, you might want to extend something because we're changing land use pattern, but that's going to be downhill. So the suitability analysis may be the limit of what analytics you can do.
So that was what I was thinking, was you were talking about a project level assessment. What I'm kind of sensing is that in some areas it may be appropriate to put in some more fuel breaks. In some areas it may not be appropriate. So to me it seemed like, isn't that what we did with the SPRs? Is that somehow, is that a way to address this issue? Is craft one that when you get down to the local level proposing a project, you have to come up with one that describes this? Is that, I'm not coming up with the language today, I'm just saying, is that concept-wise, is that a way to go? Because we have SPRs in here about road building and all kinds of things. But usually it's in about what kind of conditions, not that you can't do anything necessarily, it's just conditions. So it seems like we may be able to come up with some local mechanism.
Let's put a flag in our notes on that.
I'm just strategically trying to think of how we can address that.
Okay.
Because then it wouldn't be a wide ranging across the board. We could only use, it would be used only when it's appropriate.
Well, and when the landowner wants to do the work, that's a really big factor. It's private land, and it's difficult to do fuel breaks that cross many areas of private land because, for obvious reasons.
Yep. Okay. I think we already dealt with P93, the issue of shaded fuel breaks, which in fact, is clearly not a chaperone consideration. The next statement I felt was an overstatement. There's no conceivable way we would be treating vast areas with herbicides. P29, the bottom one of the pages, basically says. So we've gone, fuel breaks was all the way down through P59, P93 was a statement specifically about, I don't see fuel breaks in Southern California, shaded fuel breaks in Southern California. So again, it's back to where do we do a shaded field right? But then the last comment on page 34 was basically saying I don't think we should be treating vast areas with herbicides. And I think the PER does not envision treating vast areas with herbicides. So that is.
It doesn't, but I do think that we're going to be in a situation where we should flesh out the herbicide use a little bit more in terms of how many areas. Because it is not totally clear how many acres potentially could be treated out of the 60,000 acres per year, unless I missed that somewhere in the.
So let's go back to the team on that. Any comments about how we dealt with that issue? We'll come back to you in a second. So let's move on to P30 on page 35. The first one is relatively straightforward. It's a combination of I felt an overstatement of the aerial extent of the treatments with the criticism of the lack of scientific foundation. So it's the same thing we've already dealt with. 174 was an endorsement of biomass as a way to deal with fuels rather than burning, and in fact, I think the response is that this document scope takes the biomass sector as a given, but there is other work going on to assess the viability of the biomass sector. Although at the moment it's not a very healthy sector. So the current utilization, relying on a sector that was going through that level of closure, is not a good foundation. The next statement I had a little more trouble with, but again, it was reconsidering controlled burning, and I think burning is one of these efforts. But it's not. The tenor of this comment made me think that it was a little too heavy on, or that the perception was that this was about burning a lot of acres, and that was as opposed to choosing appropriate fuel treatments. And so I would have thought the response should be, where appropriate, allowable, and feasible is what we're trying to get at here, not just lots. There are places where fire is a useful tool, whether destroy natural fire. Moving on to page 36, I felt again this comes back to the statement about respecting the underlying ecological processes, especially in coastal chaparral, where frequent reburning. We're acknowledging that. And so then we're at kind of this set of comments, next 4, which are a variety of comments on the use of grazing. And we did make some changes in here, I felt, to reflect that. I think a lot of this has been moved in to respect herbivory as a potential fire management tool in the draft that we're looking at now, including, kind of the hindness and short rotation kinds of use of very directed treatments. But I think they're good comments. Dropping down to A2 at the end of the grazing, use of herbivory is a management practice. The comment on recreation, there's just a technical reference there that who should be referenced. It's potential organizations. I have nothing to say about that, and we might want to add them.
Before you leave that one.
Yeah.
Seems like, we want to add that one. And then made me just wonder.
I'm sure there might be even more.
We covered open space districts and some other potential.
The extent, we don't have the authority to do a project on county parks. So that's why an organization like them wouldn't be listed.
Oh,
So this is SRA land and
yeah.
So
Well,
it might be, but anyway, that's why.
Yeah, so if it's appropriate to add them to the list, we should.
We will, yeah.
But again, sometimes the scope of who we're talking to is defined by the limits of this process.
well, a lot of open space districts are SRA.
Yes.
I don't think county parks are. Right?
The 241 is simply a statement in support of the earlier statements. So we've dealt with that one. There's a couple substantive statements here that basically say, let's think about shrublands and the project review process. So that's really the first one. 243 is really saying what that organization's comments would be about. But in part, it's an endorsement of some of the work that was done here. So if you go down to 251, there is some concern about how many acres are actually going to be treated if you load this up to a higher level, although there is no necessary idea that some of these might be low impact activities that take place in the same acre. Is one of the things that's certainly on this. But how did you guys feel about 251 in terms of the response?
I think it's a reasonable comment.
Mm-hmm.
It just goes back to maybe rebalancing, given the number. We talked about this in the last workshop. Rebalancing some of the proposed treatments out of that one bioregion into other areas, since there's such a high level of public concern and the area is already, Southern California is already, Chaparral is already, besieged for so many other reasons. But I think it's a good comment, and that at the bioregion level, when we're looking at approval in the Sacramento office, that there are some checks and balances to how much treatment is going to be done of each treatment type, and that might need to be reemphasized in that bioregion in particular.
Okay. So that gets back, because when I read this, I was very focused on project level, and I was thinking this is where an SPR may work, kind of like what we were talking about 10 minutes ago. What you're getting at is more of, okay, how many projects then you decide to do? Well, the SPR wasn't appropriate, or because of how it looks. You cumulatively have projects. Is that what you're getting at?
Well, I think what I was getting at is that there's checks and balances built in at the bioregional and the Sacramento level to look at how much is proposed within that bioregion as part of the process.
That we need to get into it, or there already is it?
I think it's already there.
Okay.
And just to reassure people, but also consider that in that particular bioregion, whether we might want to rebalance the amount per year and move it to other areas. It will probably happen anyway. I think the amount that's going to get done, given there's an additional level of public scrutiny that happens for the outside of the wheeling and fuel breaks, public meetings, and that I think that'll take care of a lot of this. But it's clear that there's a pretty big concern.
I wouldn't presuppose, though, that the outcome of that process is such that you should rebalance the acres to start.
Yeah, well, it's part of the process.
I think really you're going to see see that play out, and it may be that there's some acres that might have been treated had you allocated them somewhere else, and we just won't see that. But I think that's part of the learning by doing and seeing what's publicly acceptable and what isn't. So I wouldn't start that process, so I think it's down the line. I agree with you. I think there are checks and balances along the way. The 3 comment is, again, it's about 1/4 of the acres being treated, so this is profound misunderstanding. P91, there is interest in environmental stewardship in rural areas and contracts to do this kind of stuff, but I don't think any of the decisions here are being made by someone having an economic interest in engaging in these activities. So that's not a focus. It's certainly not a justification in the document that would lead you to go in this direction. Then we get to 2 where I was interested in people's responses. 246, 247, we were back to this notion of condition class, and anyone on the board want to make a comment on those?
Actually, I want to go back to that last one.
Sure.
This is another theme that evidently Edith is going to work on, because I focused on, I think the comment was getting at treatments that are too far from communities is the thought.
That you'll bias your
nothing's being done near the structures. We're not advocating that.
No.
When that's not what we're doing, but it's yet another example. Thought is that, we're only doing things way out of the way. Well, that's because there's already programs in place that deal with obviously within 100 feet.
Yeah.
So it seems like it's pretty critical to get that piece in place somewhere, in a couple of places.
All right. So it would be appropriate in a comment there as well? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that we're going to hopefully address that one way or another.
Okay.
So sorry.
No, that's a good comment. So back to the 2 condition class statements.
Well, what I thought on these is that at the project level, there's a requirement to review at the project level the situation, and that it wouldn't necessarily be relying on old maps, so that the amount of disturbance would be underestimated. Because it's actually so I don't envision that people would just look at large scale maps and then not look at the fire history of the actual area that's being proposed for treatment at the project level. So I think those are, they're legitimate concerns if we didn't have the project level requirements, the project specific requirements, but we do.
But we do.
Plus, CAL FIRE is really trying pretty hard to update the fire history of areas through CalMapper, on a yearly basis.
Yeah.
So I don't actually think those, I can see how people could have those concerns.
Yeah. Okay.
If we were firing lasers from the stack.
Yeah. Yeah.
From the office console, if Edith was doing it.
The U8 comment and the A20 comment that end at page 38. Again, I think that we've dealt with this before. This comes down to what's the scope of this document versus the scope of the other programs that both the offices like the fire marshal are engaged with. 014 comes back mostly to a statement of a lack of scientific foundation, which we've dealt with before. Did anyone want to comment on their feeling about the basis for limiting movie treatments to 1,000 feet? Yeah.
I think think we should refer them to the appendix. That's Ann Faggy.
But that one was Richard Halsey.
Okay. We moved on from Ann
Yeah.
Faggy.
Mhm.
I think it'd be good to just refer back to the new appendix that describes how WUI is
Yep. So we're
derived.
back there. Yep. Okay. And that's the same comment is, you know, the statement about the WUI distance is there again. So again, reference to the appendix. Then the statement about the mapping here. I'm not sure I exactly understand the thrust of this one.
I thought it was confusion between the very high
Fire
hazard
severity zones and
WUI.
ah,
I mean, well, you know that it's not actually a mile and a half variable.
Right.
You can refer everybody back to the appendix again. But
so I think this is a concern about the blanket application of the distance,
Right.
which is not actually as the only factor that determines what class something is in. Is that maybe it?
maybe we need to go back and read this letter in total again.
I think this might be
understand
confusion about
the difference
stratification.
between, the stratification versus
Right.
you know, the WUI is just an area where there is all of these comments are written as though the entire area classified as WUI is going to be treated 100%, you know, all the time, every year. In reality, it's an area where projects can be placed.
Right.
And so, but on this letter, it sort of sounds like it's equating a very high fire severity zone to WUI. That we'll have to take a look at it. It's Kutcher, right?
Yeah, I was going to ask, are you talking about 071?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The
that's
actual
what I thought.
letter.
Yeah.
Kutcher,
yeah.
Yeah, 71. I'm going there.
Can I interject something about the WUI? It's not in any of the comments in this letter, but I was wondering if some of the concern about the WUI distance might be public input element on a project level. Just capture that at some point. Later on, we may come across that again.
Okay.
The concern about the WUI might be that they feel like they don't have the input they do put on a different classification or treatment. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think it wouldn't be true, but I think maybe it's a feeling of lack of empowerment.
Well, I think there is a distinction between public input process and the
That's true. There is.
Yeah, there is.
Yeah, you're right. While you're looking for that, were you guys ready to give us your comment? We'd asked you about the one issue, and
Yeah, it's on page 4,387. That's the air quality discussion, and that has a breakdown of the percentages of the activities. One herbicide is one of them.
Just 1 second.
Say that again, what page?
4-387.
Yes. Right. The bottom of the table there, which actually indicates the limitation of this. So thank you. That's exactly what should be referenced. While you're looking at this, if we look on page 40, there's the 3 comments at the top, all of which revolve around 1.5 miles for the WUI being silly. I think actually there is a justification here as to why we use that as the cutoff. So I think pointing to the justification that's in the document is all right. I don't feel it was incredibly arbitrary. So,
if I understand correctly, what you're saying, Sue, 1.5 is the maximum distance.
Yeah.
But there's a model.
Exactly.
Parameters, and it could be.
yeah.
So, but in these environments here, would that likely, if we follow the measures in the appendix, would it be modified or not? That's what I'm saying.
Well, when a project comes in, the unit's going to look at it and make a determination whether that falls within the WUI based upon the model set.
Well, it is kind of hard to know how that would happen. Because there's a difference, I can see why people are confused, because when it comes down to, is this a WUI project or is this a ecological restoration project? The WUI is a model buffer zone, but I'm not sure that we have an actual map. Is there an actual map of where it is everywhere? Okay,
No,
so
it's static.
yeah.
Okay. What do we know what the average distance is, or anything yet? Or I guess we have the total acres. So what constitutes
I'm Rachel Brady, CAL FIRE. It depends on what the asset is that is being modeled. So like structures and transportation areas and different things get different buffers. So it's a fluctuating buffer based off of the asset.
But we do have a set static, the total acres of the WUI.
Yes.
Considering all this is this. Yeah. So there'll be no shady back in the deals about how can I manipulate the model to get this to be a WUI.
No, it's derived from VRAP, and they produce it, they run the model, they give it to us, and that's WUI is WUI.
Okay. Good.
I can't answer now the picture. I think what she's trying to say is that if you applied a 1.5 mile buffer in Orange County, that the entire county would be, most of the entire county would be in WUI.
Okay.
And then if you look at the map, although it's
Yeah.
a small map on 436,
Yeah.
it looks like that, right?
Well, it's possibly true.
Right. It might be appropriate.
There's if there's enough dispersed development and not that much SRA, then it certainly is possible that everything could be classified that way.
Yeah.
All right. Let's move on to the next two statements, if I'm reading them right. This is a discussion we've had with Mr. Condon as part of the speed with which we can adopt different bases for vegetation classification. We've kind of been around why this analysis was what we could do at this point in time. If we were to redo this in 10 years, it might be a different basis. So I think referencing that the lack of complete coverage and the alternatives in part is
That's your famous Lord of the Rings reference. I always bring.
oh, and vegetation.
Yes. Oh, yes.
Yeah, I do. One of those cases where it's like I really need to sometimes put a disconnect in there and stuff going on in my head. There's so much of that stuff rolling around. Yes, I actually learned to write in dwarf runes at one point. So
Maybe some therapy.
yeah. So the next 024 is a statement about the range of alternatives. I think we've dealt with this in some of the other comments we dealt with earlier as to whether the scope of alternatives appropriately define the decision space. And so we've got an answer for that one.
If I may, Chairman,
And this is-
we
yeah,
did
This
discuss.
is 820.
And we did that one.
Yeah, we've discussed 41
Yeah,
through
we did, and we did.
47.
That's right. No wonder I thought we'd already discussed that because we.
This sounds
discussed that.
So there.
Good.
Good thing I used the red pen on all that. Well, now we're to enact data. We talked about alternative analysis.
Yes,
All
we
of
did. We
those.
did all of
I mean, my notes I have is on page 48.
those. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. We are on page 48. of those. And yeah. So inadequate data. So let's as a we then have.
Need to take a break discussion.
I think we're going to take a break, and we're going to come back with this. I'm trying to get here.
Forever.
Water quality, which Marcus is an expert.
All right, so we are down to just inadequate data, right? And then if we go through that batch, I think that puts us through the public comments we received so far, right? Okay, we're going to try and.
Well, I'm actually, we haven't done environmental impacts. There's a lot of them too. I mean, not to disappoint you, but.
No, that's right,
It looks
that's
to
right.
me like there's like about 40.
That's right, I
pages of
pulled
those.
out this one, so, oh, well, we're doing the best we can.
You were
folks.
hopeful.
No, I just realized I have the other stack elsewhere that I will make.
And then historical reference.
Yep.
And mitigation, not, anyway.
All right,
So we'll get the.
let's take a break. We're in recess.
Yeah, we're going to start again. Thank you.
He just wants to know.
I
how
will
we
make
have to
I will
prepare.
make bricks out of mud and straw, sir.
You could let it be number 13, so it would still be done before lunch.
Yeah. All right, let's call back into session the workshop, and again with the admonition that the CEQA comment period closed on May 21st, and that any public comment here shouldn't expect a response for the final. Okay, we are now to this large section of comments that the data is inadequate. And it's interesting to go through these, and let's pull the ones out. I mean, in general, if it's just a very broad statement, mitigation of impacts are unenforceable and unmeasurable, I mean, that's really tough for us to craft a response to. But let's go through in turn, and let's pull up the ones that potentially we can say we actually do have the best available data is cited in the report on such and such a spot or not to help with the response to these. And I don't see where I can do that on the comment U3, on U4. There were some inconsistencies. I think members already pointed a few out. I think we've got some of those better. There is a reliance on some anecdotes, but I thought they were used as illustrations, not as the foundational document. But the examples, many of them called out in boxes, are, I think, an attempt to make the document publicly accessible, not to say that the scientific foundation. Stop me as you guys want.
So I guess it's not to make it clear that are we going to have a response that covers kind of the broad concept?
I think.
And so what you're wanting us to do is focus in on the ones.
Pull up the ones where we made some more detail. Ms. Hannigan, you have to actually respond to these as the individual identified comments, even if your responses are similar across comments. Isn't that correct? Or do you batch the comments and give the response?
Closer to the latter, you can say, please see our answer to your...
Right, but I mean, but the ordering, so once you've given a response to one of these comments as you're kind of going through, but you have to say for each of these comments how they're addressed.
Yeah, more or less. These have been broken down for our ease of discussion.
Right.
So in the formal response, there won't necessarily be like U4, U5.
Exactly.
But yeah, what you described.
Right. And again, the next one, without pointing out a particular unsupported statement or particular misrepresentation, I don't think this becomes an operable comment for us. The reference to the FRAP report,
That's actually true.
that's true.
That is how SCS rated rangelands.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure how that. I mean, that's a true statement, but I don't know what it would change about. It's just sort of bad background information.
Yeah. So, might one or two sentences wordsmithing on that.
Mm-hmm.
This suggestion here about adding in the definition of AUMs as it applies to other animals for herbivory. Not sure that this becomes an operative need in terms of until you get down to the projects where you're considering using a goat. I don't know, what was the opinion of the team in terms of what you're putting in here, right? The A18, which basically says an AUM can be defined in terms of a cow, but it can also be defined in terms of a goat or something. It feels to me like that's a project level detail. I didn't think the definition of the term, the way it appeared in here, was all that critical that the nuances of AUMs were dealt with. But up to you guys. Ms. Hammond.
As the ghostwriter for this letter, sorry?
A little louder.
Oh, I said as the ghostwriter for this letter.
Yeah.
I think this is similar to A17, where the background information and in providing more detailed information to people who may not be familiar with utilizing herbivory. The Range Management Committee thought it was important to provide information for the types of animals that would be more likely used under this program. But like I think you said with A17, it was kind of that background information that they wanted revised a little bit.
Okay. Yeah, it'd be fine. I mean, can I get the? Yeah. It's a true statement. If we're moving on to A24.
I don't think
is it a problem?
I don't know if it's a problem. It's not about accuracy, it's about currency and updating. I don't think it changes anything particularly. But she's right. It is.
Right. Any comments from the team on A24 in terms of the literal accuracy of the statement? mean, since that analysis in part was to get a general feeling and number the acres, if you've got some shift categories, I'm not sure that that becomes a terribly important factor in the decision making about the PEIR.
So we use the most accurate data at the time, but as this document has continued to be open, we've continued to update it as FRAP has released things. And FRAP did just release the new WUI layer, or they're in the process of releasing the new WUI layer. So it's the same basis, it's just newer refined imagery that was used. So we're gonna fold that into the newest version. So the acreages are gonna adjust just a teensy bit, but
it's got to be kind of white noise.
It's white noise. Yeah, we ran it like the raw numbers real quick just to make sure that it wasn't any big shifts. It's staying right in line. We updated it with the latest vegetation layer in December before we gave it back, because the new veg layer came out that incorporates a lot of the concerns that Fish and Game had as well. So as it's going, we're trying to keep with the most updated data.
Okay, good, thanks. The 826 comments that has to be on published literature, not unpublished statements on legislative hearings, internal notes. Actually, I don't accept that. I think we're referencing the scientific data, but this is a field in which a fair amount of practice information exists, and which a lot of very good material only comes out in great form, and where if we're taking legislative direction in terms of the characterization of a project, something that's said in the legislative hearing is actually valuable. So I don't accept that statement, and I think we need to respond that we're drawing on all information as appropriate to both set the context and define the rationale for the program. I don't see how we can respond to 04 other than to say, kind of, it's based, the basic statement is based on a survey of the best available science and the data that was current at the time. Right? So, the course scale maps thing, dated models, in part, this is a currency argument, and in part, it's an argument about project level analysis versus PEIR kind of adequacy. The 011, we agree with the call for a sound scientific foundation. We have improved the review, and in fact, I think we have to say that the extensive treatment of the coastal chaparral that's in the document is a response to the comments we received that, address that need.
Can we
go ahead. Sure. Go ahead.
So I'm looking at Ann Peggy's comments about where she's going into the document where it says the sources is the team going to make on page 217 is the team going to go ahead and make the changes in the text that describes so both in the appendix and in the text on 217 do you think it's going to be necessary to add a paragraph about how this doesn't change things, or will the charts all have to be updated too? I mean, how far are we going to go with that?
We're going to have to visit it again when we add it, and most likely there'll be some modification to make it fit in correctly.
So the tables that give the acreages would also be will also be updated?
Yes.
It's going to be a lot of work.
Yes.
Every time we mess with the data, it turns out to be.
Well, I was wondering why you were going to do, whether it's really necessary to do that. All those, the updates that trigger the updates in the table that trigger the updates and the number of the acres treated. you know, it's a cascading effect if you update the. I just wonder whether that will cause more problems than just leaving the document as is and dealing with the anyway. It's a lot of work, and I wonder whether it will make a difference in terms of the board's selection of an alternative.
Well, I think you have to look at the tape and see if there's a material difference that comes when you're doing.
Because if it doesn't, then everything.
The material difference. No.
It just seemed. All I'm saying is, it seems like an awful lot of work. And I'm not sure what it would trigger in terms of distributing a new draft, all that kind of stuff with new numbers. I don't know.
I think your point as well, your initial point was, if it is white noise, if it's not significant, you can make that. If somebody did that initial analysis to know whether or not you would have to read the number, because I'm sensitive to people saying this data is 26 years old.
Yeah.
And so, okay, well, we did look at the newer data, and it didn't make a significant change.
As opposed to substituting all of it into another version of the document.
Well, and we did this for the veg layer when the new veg layer came out. From the very first draft that you got to this last draft that you've been given. We updated that veg layer. It's kind of a streamlined process at this point.
We know what we have to do.
I'm like, I know exactly where everything goes, and I have all of them in multiple spots. But our reasoning behind wanting to update it to the new WUI is to get rid of some of these comments that your data is outdated. I mean, we can wipe those comments straight off and say, no, we have the latest data. This is the 2016 release of WUI. Here is what it is.
Yeah. So.
I mean,
you say, I could do this, and say, well, God, do it. Unless, well, I guess, sorry to jump in here, but you're concerned, okay, does that then require recirculation? Is that what are the triggering effects of
whether it becomes yet another iteration.
Well, I think we have to be a little careful about the scope of the discussion here, that we're talking about response to these comments rather than the process by which we run through the review.
So when we're done with the scope of these comments, then we'll have to make some decisions.
You got it.
Well, sorry for jumping ahead. It sent my brain forward.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's move on to 012. There's a comment in there that there's two very substantively different kind of comments about this, and it's the first is you've actually in one case said we're citing McKelvey out of context. You know, McKelvey did have this part where he said prescribed fires generally believed to benefit the overall health of fire-adapted ecosystems, and they're saying, well, that's not appropriate as a blanket statement about California. So that's the first comment, and the second comment is to discount the statement made by Tom Bonnickson when he was giving testimony.
Is that Kevin? That's Kevin McKelvey.
Kevin McKelvey.
So that comes from.
One was in a report.
Yeah, I was. Yeah,
right.
I was there. I mean, for both of them. Yeah.
Well, I think the fact that some public comments were given by a fire scientist in a politically charged environment is not an indictment of the utility of the comment. Right. So.
Yeah, no, I don't think. Well, this seems like his Halsey's opinion.
Yes.
Yeah.
So,
I was going to ask you, well, if you have, because, the Bonnickson one, I mean, it is what it is. So, when that was the environment it was given, so it's properly cited. The McKelvey one, I was just wondering,
did that report actually deal with chaparral, or was it more of a forest-centric report?
It was a forest-centric report because we didn't actually have, we were dealing with timber, and it's related.
And that's what he does. I mean, that's what he's.
Exactly, and so it might be worth
Yeah, so I think
a couple of words injected into page 151
right,
to indicate the scope of Kevin's comments there.
right.
Just so it's not misinterpreted. But there's a whole lot of acres of that timberland, and so generally believed, it's not an untrue statement. But, it gets down to, can anything be said which applies universally? And the answer is no. Right? So it's correct, it's not a universal statement.
So, the other one comment is the bottom one is, are there some incorrect reference citations or something like that?
Yeah.
I mean, those can easily be cleaned up, obviously.
Well, there are phonics and papers, that were peer reviewed that were, and I think we could easily find a reference that that if we took a look.
Right, and so making sure, that final thing in the final draft, we crosswalk between the reference list and everything that's cited is, that's the last step. And the one that always takes longer than you think. That's a 2-hour job and it ends up taking me a day before I submit the paper. The 13 one, this is saying, referencing general statements about from an introductory chapter of a book on California fire is inappropriate, and in fact, a book like the one by Vtpeir et al. is in fact a meta-study of all the studies, so in fact it is a synthesis, and for a document which we're trying to make accessible to the public as well, it's actually an entirely appropriate reference from my point of view. And so we're citing a variety of literature, and that's actually a good one to point people to as a synthesis of a lot of California literature on fire. So at least that would be my opinion. I don't know, Sue.
Yeah, well, I think that it's kind of an odd comment. It's not really an introductory chapter.
No, it's really quite a compilation of a lot of studies. So it's the kind of place that I think from the public, that's where I want to direct them, where you could branch out and find more nuanced citations of literature than be overwhelming. So we've got the statement about the old data again. If we move on to 015, I think we've already dealt with, we're going to have to make a reference to what year of hazard maps and whether we're updating the data. The next one is the same. It's also about what data fire hazard we're going to use. The 20, I think we've already discussed how we're going to deal with that, and just have to see if in some cases there's any material thing, but because this isn't project specific, it's trying to get at most of the times. These maps are to get at overall acres. It's not generally going to make a material difference in tabular or graphical data. Sweeping generalizations. I think a statement is we've tried to achieve a balance for a public document of this sort.
Which one do you mean?
021, sorry. Don't avoid sweeping generalizations. Don't rely on the fallacy of authority. And I don't think really I think we're trying to make an accessible document that shows the scientific foundation. So I don't know how to respond to that. I don't feel we are relying on the fallacy of authority.
Yeah, I agree.
And yes, we want to eliminate errors in citations and so forth, but to some extent there are some differences. The consistency issue, we've deliberately emphasized some areas more than others in response may have too much data for the purpose, or too much treatment for the purposes of this document, but that's in response to public comment. And I don't think it'd be appropriate to either whittle back where we've added stuff in response to public comment or increase data in other sections. Right. And so, again, this is like the comment about tree cover in proximate to homes. It's an endorsement of forest type or forest cover ecologically, and I think it has to be, to some extent, in this vegetation treatment program, we're respecting ecological integrity in the analysis of projects, but this is not meant to be a manual for defining forest condition broadly, as much as certain activities that would take place in a limited number of acres on some land which is forest. I just don't quite see that we're contesting issues like, there isn't evidence provided for this logging logging standing dead trees rooms contrary to most available science. I think I'd be more comfortable saying these are tough to respond to on an individual basis, and I don't have a response about the scientific foundation or our feelings about the scientific foundation generally. I'm trying to counter those statements or removing biomass will deplete the future soil nutrients. There's a scientific consensus about that. So some of these declarative statements are difficult to deal with.
I don't think anything in 040 is dull.
Yeah.
I agree.
Yeah. So. I don't. Well, I think it was maybe statements at a general level to us, not something that was a criticism necessarily to respond to. So
the point is let it burn, right?
I guess.
I think this is one of those comments that's best viewed in the context of their letter.
The rest of the letter.
Yeah, because a lot of times they say this and we agree, but then they come to a different conclusion about how to, So, but yeah.
The next statement.
And all these, isn't that what these next couple statements are? They're all from the same author. They're all from the same document.
Yeah, so based on the way these are numbered, 040, 041, 042, they're all from the same letter, and just from how I organized it, that means that like 042, that's the text in the letter that came right after 040. Right. So you actually can kind of read the letter as, in this instance, you can read the letter kind of as it was submitted, which might be more helpful to you.
Well, it goes on.
It goes on through 054 on page 58, and it is the commenters. It's the commenters' review of prior literature. Not all of them are issues that are in direct contradiction or directly contradicting something that's in the report. So. I guess I'd have to say, are there any interesting in terms of what's the level of individual responsibilities we have to do? It's assertion woody biomass carbon combustion is not carbon neutral. This is actually a point of some controversy, and it comes down to how do you count. So, I don't know, I could use some guidance there, so the standard of comment response that we'd be expected to do on the assertion of an individual's interpretation of an element of the literature.
Are you talking about these comments generally?
Yeah, this whole section from the same author, from 41 through 54 under oath.
Yeah, I couldn't tell you. We'd have to get some feedback on that too. So, TBD, I guess.
Right. So, I mean, the statement, high-intensity fires are vitally important to maintain and restore oaks to its conifer forest. In the disruption ecology, sort of said, yes, the oaks will come back, killing them down to the stumps roots will come back. They have a root. They have an advantage because they'll be growing faster than anything else in the stand, and so yes, it does renew the black oak productivity. So, I mean, these are true statements, but I don't know.
Well, the letter...
Or some of them are true statements. It's tough to get.
The letter starts out by advocating for all the comments that were made by the California Chaparral Institute. And then there's the 22 million acre thing again, and then there's a discussion of defensible space again, and that's where the stuff about Jack Cohen begins. But everything in this section, and it's in a series of comments.
Sometimes saying this is a good study, that's a bad study.
Is the rest of the letter.
Right. Yeah.
So we're going to be dealing with the comments about logging.
And I'd have to say right now,
it doesn't
you can reference the fact that until the state's forest carbon plan is done, actually, well, what the conclusion is going to be on an issue like that is not the purview of this group, and it's an area of controversy.
I think she does a nice job of that.
It's a nice review of a lot of fire literature, and it's the same literature. I mean, we could credit that and say much of this literature was the same literature that was reviewed. It's support to provide a scientific foundation for this EEIR. There may be some differences as to the conclusion, but it is the same literature. So I think in part an acknowledgement that many of these studies were actually reviewed in context of developing the EEIR would be quite appropriate. But acknowledging that people could come to a different conclusion, trying to synthesize across those studies and come to a policy recommendation.
Well, yeah, and that's what my thoughts and what I've seen letters like this. There's on a lot of things, there's a lot of mentions of biological and forestry both. Impacts from high severity fires and what kind of habitats they provide.
Yeah.
It seems, because there's no bright line out there, usually the response to some comments like this is a point counterpoint type response, because a lot of these statements are factual.
Yeah, a lot of them.
So it's not like, I don't know if they've been taken
out of
context.
Interpretation, I'd probably agree with.
Yeah, well, there's potentially a range of interpretations.
Right.
And that's what maybe we need to say.
But I think
is that and then
yes.
As decision makers for this document, we chose this point of the spectrum when we looked at this information.
So that's right.
Like
a reference to the scientific literature, a broad survey. There is actually a statement in here as the foundational documents that there's a review of the scientific literature. So I think a response in part should point out the fact that much of this research is cited. Not every piece of research is cited, in fact, because sometimes you're looking at a study that synthesizes results of component studies. So acknowledging that, but
acknowledging that there's this range and that that this information isn't necessarily, this isn't incorrect.
Yeah.
No.
It's that there's this range, and then there are probably some elements of it that are controversial in just the interpretation itself. But when we looked at that same data set or similar information, this is where we fell. I don't know. It just seems like it's going to take a little more thoughtful, we're going to provide staff with maybe a little more direction we kind of on some of these.
Well, this letter, if you...
They're just kind of just blurting out.
Yeah.
Kind of where he is on this one.
Well, I just took a look at the letter, and it's worth, Edith is right, it's worth looking at. All these sections look like they came from another letter commenting on something else. And were appended to, it's basically a letter of support for the Chaparral Institute's
conclusions and recommendations.
And then it goes into it segues into a discussion about logging in general and how it's, and then there's an expansion of why the author feels that removal of trees is not a good idea and that fire regimes will do a better job. So it's hard to see, there's a really clunky transition between the first section supporting the Chaparral Institute's point of view on treatment in Chaparral, and then a segue to a discussion of the role of fire in forests. I'm not sure how I would respond to it, Edith, because the whole second section doesn't seem to be pertinent to the PT, to the document that they were reviewing. I don't know how you feel about it. You must have read it a few times and tried to figure it out.
Without having looked at it in depth recently, I think the assumption is that the writer does mean this to apply to the VTP. We don't want to take away.
Yeah.
And as best as we can apply their comment to the document and formulate a response to it, we will. If it there. I think just as best we can take their comments and apply it to the VTP, and either we considered that data already and came to a different conclusion, or we didn't, and here's why, and try to respond accordingly.
A couple of comments that come to mind is obviously the Vtpeir is on a commercial logging permit, so that
right, yeah.
And then the other one is that the Vtpeir is not going to eradicate fire from the landscape. And so you can still have this range of fire severity that we've been through items.
Yeah, clarifying the program when necessary, yeah.
But I was wondering whether any of when we get to the carbon sequestration comments, whether we need to look at what's in the document versus these comments here. They don't seem to be a direct response to material.
No, I don't think they are. And in fact, we can't go much farther. The forest carbon plan for the state is still a ways off. And so that's not an argument for saying, because there will always be a piece that you're referencing in the regulatory apparatus that is in some process of development. So we can check to make sure that we don't say anything appropriate about the state's carbon plan, but given that we're still not at a point of agreement about how we're going to measure carbon, and there was a paper just out this week by Battles about his feelings about the use of remote sensing versus FIA as the basis for measuring the carbon. So this is not an area where the scientific record is resolved or the policy record. So and that's what I felt about the 54.
So what are getting back to all these, sorry to drag us back a little bit, but I'm kind of confused on what are we going to do about this letter then? Because I guess I'm seeing almost 4 pages of pretty pertinent biological scientific citations, and I'm pretty sure a lot of these weren't cited in the Vtpeir. I'd be surprised if we were citing a lot of the Hutton and Raphael and Hutto and
You mean in the sections on far effects on wildlife?
yeah. So I'm trying to.
So what is the standard? Do we have to respond to each citation that's been proposed?
No, I'm not. No, but well, I guess I want to be careful that
Yeah.
we say that, well, we've looked at the same science, and I'm not so sure we have.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we've looked at effects of fire. I don't want us to say, yeah, we've looked at all these literature citations when I'm not sure we probably have, unless I could be corrected. It's pretty specific.
Well, I think this is a place, correct me. I think this is a place where, as biologists especially, but we would want direction from the board because these people have brought up, studies and data and saying, what you've used is inadequate. Here's this. Look at this instead. And we need direction from you as the board, both as the experts in this area and as this being just your document.
But we have to be careful on that. I'm a scientist.
Yeah.
I'm not on this board as a scientist.
Okay.
And I am not.
Fair, yeah. Fair.
And so we have to think about what are our roles on the board. And in effect, it's our document, but it is something that was prepared with the assistance of CAL FIRE staff. And so while we have to be comfortable that it's based on the science, it's not a scientific product that comes from the expertise of the board as scientists per se. And so
Yes.
I think I want to be a little careful about that.
I can rephrase.
This is a very unusual board, and that there's more scientific expertise on the board, I think, at the moment than in the history, probably, of the Board of Forestry. But I'm a public member.
Yeah, no, let me rephrase that.
Yeah.
The public has brought up these varying studies and data sources, and if the board believes that there is a compelling argument to look further into some of these studies and utilize them, then
and we would need to identify.
You would, and then the staff that have done the research and to determine this document would investigate those and come back to you and say, we've looked at this and it's valid, and we'll adjust the document this way. We've looked at this and we don't think it's valid, and here's why.
But in part, I think we have to rely on a process argument here.
Yeah.
To deal with the issue I've just raised. So, for instance, there is a criticism just a little farther down the page that says, it's actually on page 59, about grouping into tree-dominated, grass-dominated, shrub-dominated. Really, it's criticizing this as the scientific framing of the document. That framing was in direct response to our going out to the Fire Science Consortium for advice. And so the answer would be back, yes, really. And so partly whether or not the key science has been referenced, partly, is a process argument where we've been trying to engage with groups outside the board as scientific input, right? So we can go through these individually if board members want to say.
No, I guess I want to understand how we're going to frame this. I see this as a potential issue that I think we can ideally address. Like I mentioned before, I'll take another swipe at it, was we were talking about before was it's a range. Mm-hmm. And we're choosing as in this document to treat vegetation, to not have as many and as large, and probably as intense, high intensity fire areas. Okay, we're choosing, we're not going to eliminate fire from the landscape.
Just modify.
But we're not going to just let it go
Right.
and create. So a lot of the science in here is probably accurate for areas that are high intensity fires. And if you want to let a landscape do nothing but that, not considering all the other benefits that a landscape provides our society.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess that's another way of saying, yeah, we can address this as a process, in that we've chosen that we have to protect structure, we have to protect communities. We also need to provide for listed species and clean water and all those things. And those sometimes are in conflict with this list. Even though these scientific statements are probably accurate for certain species that are cited. It just seems like we've got to kind of get this right. I mean, and it's the framing of it. I'm not worried about the detail. It's like, how are we going to frame? What direction are we going to provide you to frame this?
I'd like to offer a couple things real quick.
Yeah.
There's two things the way you've broken down there. One is the effects of fire. And so if we think that this document as written sees fire as bad, and high intensity fire is bad, but there's science that shows fire plays a benefit for various benefits. I guess I would ask you or ask staff, I'm assuming that we should capture that correctly, the role of fire, the winners and losers in fire.
Exactly.
And we should reflect, and the science reflects that. Relative to, again, we're not going to eradicate fire, so you're still going to have these range of fires. And so to this Martisonian's concern that there will be no more high severity fires or whatnot, well, that's not the case, those habitats. So we're modifying a little bit. So I just wanted to answer your question, how do we address what is the science of fire, and there's effects of what we're proposing. I think there are two ways that we go about it.
Well, we may need to include a reference, something along the lines of what just came out in a study, which I think was the statement which resonated to me as the best synthesis, which was some humorous reference to Goldilocks fires. Right? So we've had a study come out recently that says what we need, a resilient landscape is a highly heterogeneous landscape. And part of a highly heterogeneous landscape and resilience is a variety of different types of fires. And that in fact, you don't want lots and lots of high intensity fires, even though those are important for some things. You also want lots of low intensity fire. And you want some areas that are not just burning because of so many ignitions through the anthropogenic activity that it's burning
more frequently.
Too frequently, right? So there's that notion of a balance coming in, and anyone that says we need, high intensity fire, that's the answer, it's critically important. It's like, yep. And so is low intensity fire. And so in some types is long periods with no fire. Right? So I think somehow we have to get that balance in there and move away from the notion that there is a right way. And there at least is one study that just came out, which I think makes that point nicely. And
There have been a bunch of others.
just recently. I mean, that fire literature is evolving pretty rapidly.
The only thing about this letter, and you really should go back and read the letter.
Mm-hmm.
All of these sections, there are other sections where there's a criticism of the document, but this whole section is just a summary of the role of fire in California.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
And there is no conclusion drawn from it. It's just got a heading, and then there's all these references and citations. They're more detailed citations than we have in the document, and this is a really good literature review of most current literature. But there's not a section before or after it that says, and because of all this information,
Therefore.
There's no therefore there. And that's why it's worth looking at the letter.
I'd like to reread it because
The first section is pretty clear. Doesn't like the WUI, agrees with the Chaparral Institute but then this section goes into mostly forested ecosystems and doesn't, after a short section on water logging doesn't work, of fire, but it doesn't actually lead to a conclusion about how we should change the document. If you read it, I couldn't find it.
I appreciate that point, because reading it just right off the cuff, you assume that they're saying,
No, there's
stay away
no-
from the ecological restoration, stay away from.
No, there's no conclusion out of, and you guys should read it too, but I don't know that it requires us to add all those citations.
No, I don't think, I'm not advocating that either. I was trying to write some notes and kind of to provide some guidance to the team.
Yeah.
But it sounds like, and Keith kind of brought it up, is if we could cite a couple documents that describe this balance, if that's not already cited in the
Well,
document.
a couple of those papers are very, very recent.
Yeah, and in that we believe this VTPER is going to create a balance that's going to have both low, moderate, and high severity fires that'll benefit a wide range of species, including some of the ones that were cited in it. You don't have to go to the whole citation.
Right.
But I think that's kind of the logic I was kind of hoping for from this discussion.
I think that's good.
That would
I
be
think that's
kind
a
of the
good
line of
summary.
logic to then say, because they're just saying high severity fire. You know,
Yeah.
and that's all we want out there. So we think this plan will provide some of that, but we don't think for the other benefits that the board and CAL FIRE and this VTV can provide, we don't want to see high severity all the time. Right?
Right.
I mean, this is all about fuel treatments to modify fire behavior, right? It's not to provide this fire or that fire.
Right.
Although some of the treatments treat fuel that will modify in the future, but not to eliminate high severity fires. I mean, so
Well,
it's-
there'll be many high severity fires.
but maybe to address the issue of uncharacteristic fires due to fire suppression, it's fuel loads.
That's right. You have to go back to the purposes of the program.
Which the carbon fluxes is a tricky thing. You know, and I don't even know how to feel that, but maybe tear off some of the work that's being done on the market.
You know,
So is that clear as mud?
Silt, maybe.
There's silt.
Well, you'll still have an opportunity, you'll be addressing this letter in its totality.
Yeah.
So we've already looked at sections of it and come up with some responses. And then when you get to this section, I think it's a pretty good literature review of the current state of the science on fire, present and past fire regimes in forested ecosystems in California and Oregon and Washington. But there's not a good nexus to the actual document that they're commenting on.
Yeah. Right. It's other than where there were specific references to say, I think you over-extrapolated from the Kelby's conclusion, something like that. There are a few instances. That wasn't in this comment, but I mean, there are a few where it references back to here in other people's comments about what
Well, then we
specific
can just
people.
refer that commenter to this commenter's literature review and we'll solve the whole thing.
All right. We're actually over the announced agenda time for this, and so I wish we could have made more progress, but we made progress. And may I suggest that for all the board members, we actually reprint our breakdown of comments, but highlight the comments we have already discussed and trying to give board direction on. And that way, maybe everybody can come in with sort of a classification of, is this an overstatement of impact statement, is this a lack of science foundation statement, and let's come in with those and see if we can move through the rest of this in due course. I think the discussion today has been really useful because where we went off the specific comments, it was how do we respond to a general class of comments, and we needed to deal with enough of those specific comments in that class to get a feel for where the board stood on what an appropriate response was.
So next time we're going to continue with inadequate data?
I I think that's right where we will pick up. And
So we're going to start on
we left off
number
at
062. 62?
yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, that's at the end.
Although I think we've actually been dancing around the next four, but we haven't dealt with them specifically. We've dealt with on 72 this issue of where your interpretations are wrong, and interpretations are what interpretations are. 73 was mostly a statement, one of those overstatement of impacts. Do not clear all the chaparral. We are not going to clear all the chaparral.
But where are we going to start again?
I think we'd start at 62.
62.
Yeah, because we're over time, so I stopped there. We've kind of dealt around the others, but we'll come back to that.
If we finish inadequate data, what are we going to do after that?
The next big category was.
That helps me to know what the.
Well, that's why I
Yeah,
said.
and I'll put this in an email to you too.
You'll
But
put it in email to us.
yeah,
Ecological values.
environmental impacts assessment.
And then we have
starting on
one
page
category,
80.
And we're not going to do ecological values next. We're going to go to.
Ecological values was a lot of what I think the chairman was calling today, like non-operable comments.
Okay. So we want to do environmental impacts next.
So we'll give you highlighting to indicate the comments that we really haven't dealt with. And just focus our attention.
Yes.
Member Miles.
So after we finish going through all the comments, then is Edith going to come back and say, okay, here's a summary of recommendations for changes to the actual text, or how do we handle that final?
In some cases, we've been making changes all along. That's why we have, like a last summer version, a 215 version, and there's a January version, and now you have the world's largest binder distributing to you. So at the end, we're in the same place. Like I say, we're talking about comments today. We'll have a discussion about potential reissuance or whatever for a final. We'll get to that, but I think we're all due for one more big read before we're through this, right?
It'll be a summary of changes at the end that comes back, and here's how we can weigh how much change.
To some extent, I would urge board members not to simply try and look at a summary of changes, because part of this is you're looking at a document where you need to say, would someone picking up the revised version, how would they respond? And so you're going to have to put the whole thing into context. And so parts of it that are real familiar reading, they may go through fast, but I think there's no substitute for putting yourself in the place of a member of the public, seeing this document when it comes out for final comment, if that's the path we go down. So, because the person on the reading end of something that comes out with a bunch of changes in is that document. And your interpretation of that is highly colored by how familiar different pieces of the document still are.
Unfortunately, I suspect somebody's will come to this board and say, what do you want to do now? We renotice this for 60 days. Do we not?
That's right. We'll have that discussion in a hearing. So, this is the way that we'll go. Okay. All right. Thank you for your patience. Thank you, guys. We're getting there. Workshop is adjourned. That's right.
I'm sure there's always something.
It better be. I mean, I like looking at it.
I like the strategy.
So it's one of those things I envy my wife in the sense that once she's charted her last patient, she walks out of the office, she's done. Whereas there are other jobs where you barely define when you're going to stop today, Right?
Yes, we are.
You know, you're in that world as well.
Yeah, like an effort. I can put stuff down here.
When
That's
one
not
is
what we are, but I can see.
It is. You know, some days I'll try and I've been working a bunch of 80, 90-hour weeks, and I just kill myself. If you find some software.
So this monitor
This is the same version that we use for public comment.
online.
It's online, yeah, it's the exact same thing. There were just enough people who were requesting more copies and needing more copies.
Okay.
And these are much better computers.
Okay, so all this is not working on it, it's all.
It's all the same.
So-
Yeah, so we have the whole copy at home still.
And this is, I just have, this is all scholarship.
Right, yeah, no, this is all the same, as long as this is the marks, 2000.
How do you just crackle it all off?
Yes, it's actually.
Yeah.
HTTP site.
Yeah, that's the same as what we're pushing it out.
I was thinking more of what they do for you, it's a easy way.
It's not an errata sheet.
It's like, it's not an errata sheet.
Problematic,
Actually, I want to
hard.
do you know what dark is?
She is.
Okay, then I'll give a copy of
And that's kind of, you know, revise it to be.
So there's
Yeah.
So I need to go upstairs and
Page 89,
Yeah.
I think I might have a hard time understanding this
Yeah.
big picture
Yeah, you're supposed to provide.
You do also try to get it, right?
without knowing
You know, a burn.
what you track.
Yeah, yeah.